Hello everyone, welcome to the 7th RISE Talk. My name is Jacqueline Yu, an ESRC postdoctoral fellow at Durham University Business School. The RISE Talk is an academic initiative which is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and hosted by the Center for Innovation and Technology Management in partnership with the Ustinov Global Citizenship Program at Durham University. The purpose of the RISE Talk is to facilitate an interdisciplinary discussing and conversation of how traditional theories inform our understanding of contemporary phenomenon, resilience, innovation, strategy, and ecosystems, and how the role of RISE can help to address some of challenges faced by organizations and societies in pursuit of sustainable development goals. Today, it's our great honor to have our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Chris Carr from the University of Edinburgh Business School, who will lead today's seminar and discuss a key idea for business and society, global oligopolies. This idea is based on his over 5 decades research combining large statistic data analysis with intensive field work and his personal experience in companies. Chris will also joined by 2 other speakers, Abhijit, who is business continuity and disaster recovery managers in Fanduel, Edinburgh, and Purva, who is a commercial analyst of global sustainable technology firms, Johnson Matthey, to give 2 presentations. From 2 to 3, global oligopolies, the wealth of nations, the cases of Carr and professional IT services, and then from 3 to 4, cross-cultural leadership adaptations, expatriate managers in India and Thailand. We thank our Doctor Society and the CITM Doctor Student Group to organize Q&A session at the Coffee Club from 4 to 5. Without further ado, please join me to welcome Professor Carr, Abhijit, and Purva.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline, and it's a particular pleasure to be back here in Durham University. 22 years ago, I was senior lecturer at Manchester Business School in charge of the strategy side. We've been there for 9 years, and I had the immense privilege of being shortlisted for the chairs in strategy at both Durham and at Edinburgh University, with the interviews only about 2 days apart. Edinburgh came back and said yes, and so I've been there for 22 years, but you might have been my bosom colleagues by this time if the coin had just flicked the other way. So thank you very much for having us. And I want to say a big thank you to my co-authors for coming. First of all, Abhijit doing the first presentation with me with an Indian perspective on the whole global professional IT sector, and secondly, Purva Vaswani, who is doing completely the opposite, with actually an Indian perspective on exactly how should expatriate leaders from all over the world adapt when they come to India. So we've got 2 Indian inputs with really deep knowledge. I've done some research in these countries, but I, of course, am not be an actual speaker. So we're very pleased to have that support. And in honour of these two, GKN, where I worked for about 6.5 years, was really the only survivor from the British automotive sector. We all think about the car companies like Rover, where they went. But actually, 30 years ago, there were lots of household name companies, and they've all gone. And the big survivors were GKN, because we went global, and another company that's slightly unusual, Johnson Matthey, who really are a little bit more, they do catalytic converters, a little bit more the material side, and you've got the two last survivors here today. And in their honour, I've got the world car industry. I've got the original, what the cars used to be like before new technology went in, and I've seen that experience, and so we might talk about it, through to the more modern cars. And I've also brought the Russian car industry with a few bits of falling off it. That's what we used to do to get around Moscow. So hopefully that will set the scene and remind you of some of the things we will talk about. Okay, so thank you for that background. Basically, it's actually, I need to add to that 40 years, 10 years before with British Aerospace and GKN, where I was a chartered mechanical engineer and also a chartered accountant working on process product development in the forgings industry, and then working on going global for GKN, building, our little format team built the US huge plants at Sanford and Raleigh that spearheaded what's called the triad strategy, taking Europe to America. We had another deal in Japan, and we didn't realize at the time that it became a completely go global strategy with India and China following and going global. So I'm also by background, I took 50 years ago today, I began economics at Cambridge. I was allowed to skip my final aerodynamics special course. I'd already worked in aerodynamics at British Aerospace, so let me skip that. Skip the first year of the economics dry course, and I was allowed to do a special 2 years so I could take my finals in economics. So I do have my final degree from Cambridge in economics, and I just felt that there were thousands of economists coming out, and I was the one economist that was actually working with British Aerospace and the automotive industry. I could go and kind of bring something back to the subject from the outside world. And so what I've done in the 40 years that Jacqueline's kindly mentioned is really, first of all, looking at global strategy, comparing the British, the Germans, the Americans, the Japanese. They're the best in the world. So that began the study. Then it's become all sectors, but half the study always automotive. And so for 40 years, what I've done is always taken one major strategic investment with each company. So that's 382 case studies, 21 countries, 40 years, so quite a lot of longitudinal research. And so I'm happy to share that. And in a way, the book is the culmination of that, a little bit orientated towards things for my students, but quite a heavy read, quite a lot of analysis. And I'm going to give you a taster today, as well as we're doing 2 taster studies of some of the things you can do with the more global perspective. So I come from Edinburgh, so my first inaugural lecture 22 years ago was Adam Smith, because Adam Smith came from Edinburgh about the same time as our company GKN was born as well, 1790 or something, 1770, whatever, 56. So really, Adam Smith's model of classical economics opened the theory really of open market economics, which has had so much impact in the world. It was translated by my colleagues at Moscow State University. Luckily no one noticed for plagiarism, but it became almost the centre of the American Revolution that they adopted that philosophy. And I have to say that I am an enormous fan of how powerful that system has been worldwide, so I'm quite a fan of that, particularly if you contrast it with century upon century that came before, which was essentially feudalism. The way that you created and appropriated wealth was basically military might. Kings and, to some extent, religion, the church appropriated all assets, and the rest of us were serfs with no savings. Only at the time of the Industrial Revolution could we start opening the markets more fully, could entrepreneurs begin the process of the division of labour, which has now gone global. So the Malthusian pessimism is easy to forget, but the idea was in those days, and it was true for century after century, every time you increase your productivity, what happens is the population rises and you back to square one in terms of GDP per head. We broke that cycle because markets came together with new technology. Mike Abhijit was the first of the iron masters that laid the roots of the Industrial Revolution. We have wonderful archives there. And Britain was actually, at the time of Adam Smith's book, #2 in the world on GDP per head. He said all economists are Jeremiahs, don't take any notice of them. And sure enough, by the time of the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, we overtook the #1, which was Holland, by some 12% on GDP per head. So America follows suit with the same broad model. But what was hypothesized was that if you really use markets, the famous pin industry, we can get 400-fold increase in productivity compared with you just using your craft industry on the local village. It's enormous potential for the world. And what has happened is that division of labour really has gone global as markets have opened up. And that is what has taken not just us out of poverty, but in the last 30 years, if you look at what's happened to China, absolute transformation in terms of taking people out of poverty. It is quite incredible as the system has opened up. Now, the only lacunae that is very serious in the Adam Smith model, which is still there in the neoclassical model today, is the assumption that markets are so fragmented that effectively you don't need to really grapple with the problem of scale. And think for a moment about the implication of that. Fragmentation is simply what is the market share of the top 4 players. If it's very, very low indeed, what you have is a commodity market. Your profit is only the cost of capital. If that, you can never make excess profits, you can never build a business. If that were the case, we in large corporations would not bother to get out of bed in the morning. The way we make money, the way we create wealth is actually the opposite. We absolutely eschew, avoid any markets like that when we are developing markets globally. But if you think about the implication, if you really knew that all markets would be really fragmented with literally thousands of players, as was conjectured by Adam Smith, if you really knew that, well actually nothing would matter. You wouldn't need to worry about corporate strategy because we would all be slaves to the local little market. We just produce to the price. There's nothing we can do. That is exactly the opposite to what you do in a major corporation unless you are completely done. We have to have corporate strategies. The corporate strategies of Amazon or Apple have created wealth on a scale that Adam Smith never ever imagined. But, so first of all, you have that danger you neglect corporate strategy. And economists famously still tell their students, you don't have to open the box of corporate strategy. Absolute twaddle. They say that because they don't know how to open the box of corporate strategy and because it forces them to deal with the interface between two disciplines. But it's absolutely crucial. Secondly, if you really believe that all markets were totally fragmented, you wouldn't have to worry about geography. I mean, does it matter if someone produces in China? If I've only got 0.01% of the market here, it's all the same there. You don't worry about geography. The whole field of international business would not exist, or would not be taken seriously. That is absolutely wrong. Thirdly, I'm a chartered engineer. I've worked in engineering and process product development. Your view of technology is, well, that's kind of an exogenous function, as if it's something from heaven or something. Again, from an engineering perspective, absolute nonsense. With respect to Michael Porter, we do not spend all our life just shoring up entry barriers, because we're aware of that strategic implication in the overall strategy. That is not what we do as engineers. We create value through dynamism, through creating new technology, through moving it around the world. So these are the lacunae in Adam Smith that I address in the book. At the opposite extreme is Karl Marx's thesis, which influenced half the world, including China, Russia, Iraq, where I've worked, and so on. The opposite extreme is the Marxist model. And Marx said to Adam Smith, look, I completely agree. We have this 400-fold type scale economy. And by the way, it's even more massive in internet or social-based social networking, because we have externalities. I agree with you, but Adam Smith, please realize, if that's the case, the logic is those scale economies so big, you will get concentration, not fragmentation. And by the way, why should that not go global? In which case, the CR4 concentration ratio 1 goes to 1. Actually, the CR1 concentration ratio 1, the share of the top player, goes to 1 globally, not just in America. We have two opposite paradigms. Both have an element of truth. So the critique is, surely what we're going to see is global monopoly. At the other extreme is Adam Smith imagining is going to be fragmentation. There's no monopoly at all. And of course he does not like monopolies, quite correctly, because they can be very negative. So who's right? Well, the easiest way to settle this is to look sector by sector. You don't have to generalize. We can analyze every single sector there is. Because we started, I think in Harvard, Gemma Watt had moved up from 3 sectors to 10. So David Collis and myself at Harvard spent 5 months ago, knocked it up to 50 sectors that we could do. And we can then create a map for you. And to show you the dynamics of it, we just put, we couldn't get all of them on. This is an article in Slow Management Review. We just showed the concentration ratio, that is just adding up the shares of the top 4 companies, but doing it globally, and doing it sector by sector. We show the old one on the x-axis, the more recent one on the y-axis, so you can see the dynamics. Any sector above that 45-degree line is slightly increasing the concentration metric. Anything below is decreasing it. But in theory, economists in America, even in just one market, would say if you get to 40% CR4, we would expect all sorts of collusion. You'd have all sorts of power. You'd make lots of extra profits. But of course, the American economists had never done it globally. They've only ever done it on one little market in the USA. We did it globally. Much harder data to get. And so you can see now where all the sectors are. You're never, generally speaking, 40% is incredibly high. You might think, oh, I'll get lots of collusion, but you don't. As a matter of fact, the car industry is pretty typical. That's the average. The car industry is there. We're below the line, decreasing concentration. Some economists vaguely thought that would mean that Professor Gemma Watt thought that would mean we would not have to worry about global mega mergers or strategy because we're below the line. And I know why, I understand his thinking as an economist, but no. What happens when you fall below the line is not the end of global competition. It's global wars. Because what is happening in the car industry is that General Motors and Ford, the world number ones, who once had over 60% of all world car production, they are ceding ground to the next Schumpeterian players, who are initially are Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and the Germans. And then the Schumpeterian effect comes in. It is global wars that bankrupted General Motors 3 or 4 years ago. And you might say, well, perhaps it's nice gentle collusion. No, it is not. In fact, concentration ratio falls. So once you have a map, you are like a sailor going to sea when at last you don't have to hit the rocks. But my advice to you is never go to sea without your chart. If you generalize, if you make conjectures about all sectors, do we have to worry about globalization, yes or no? That is overgeneral. If you should know the metrics for your sector, and you can see it varies. You do not want the same strategy in wine that we used in British aerospace when we have virtually a global duopoly. We have to understand that, and it's going to be vital to strategy. It's going to be vital to any idea of how you make money. These guys make money because they are appropriating global oligopolies about 40% of all profits that there are in the entire world. If you don't know about that, you're missing the plot. So we then took the work we did at Harvard and thought, well, we'll take that further. Here are 176 sectors back in 2010. Notice that the number of sectors which are fragmented is remarkably low. Now, fair enough, I'm biased towards data where data is available, and that rules out some industries. But even so, can you see that we only have a tiny number of sectors left in the world where we have fragmented global competition? And once you get to 20%, believe you me, you get global M&As. Anything above 10%, we'll start seeing moves, counter moves. It's not post-collusion, but we are having to keep up with very often a global war to survive. But just look how concentrated those sectors are. I developed my own concentration metrics, rather like the Beaufort wind scale that I use when I sail. You know, the force 1 is almost no competition up to force 12, just aggregating all the TR4s together. And you can then see the change over time from 1994 to 2009. So if you're down there, that's under 5, that's coming up to 5% anyway of all the global market. You've got quite a lot of scale if you have 5% of the global market. But notice, please, the two extremes. The Marxist extreme is right at the top. We have moving towards global monopoly. The Adam Smith neoclassical model extreme is down there, virtually non-existent. The normal extreme is in the normal sector is in the middle and is averaging about 40% concentration in the middle. And it's also dynamic. It is not fixed. So what is actually happening is neither perfect competition. I like Smith, but it's not just a neoclassical economics. It's certainly not equilibrium, as Keynes pointed out. No, the general theory, the general case is not equilibrium, it's disequilibrium. And Schumpeter would say the same. What is happening is the Schumpeterian model on a global scale. He hypothesizes that a new technology paradigm comes along, and like evolution, if it's good, we scale up. The word in evolution is amplification. And we do. We get concentration. My company, we concentrate about 100 industries at home, taking over companies where necessary. But we get scale. And that's amplification. But that is not the end of the story. Because that means as we come up, the incumbents go down. The concentration metric falls as we come up. As we get to the top, the next entrepreneur comes along. And it goes down again. And it starts cycling. And it's like musical chairs. If you say to your students, 20% of you are going to fail, what happens is they start looking at each other and think, I think maybe I better work hard. And then we start taking the chairs away, and you start realizing you're going to have to run because he's running. And it's like that. We are squeezing out marginal capacity all over the world. Whole nations lose their entire output. They fight. And we have to compete, and we have to understand scale. And it's dynamic and it's disequilibrium. So if we take 15 of those industries and we do longitudinal studies, it looks like spaghetti. But it's not Marx, it's not Adam Smith, it is Schumpeter. It is the cycle that we expect. And you notice that you get to 40%, it will not just keep rising and rising. It can't, by definition. But at that level, when it dips slightly, as it did in cars, believe you me, even the world number one, GM, can go bankrupt. It's a very powerful competitive effect. So I've developed a new universal perspective, and it's really saying, imagine this. First of all, just look at your industry, any industry you care to name. Just use your common sense. Is most of the competition at home? There are some industries I really hate. Trivial industries, like the hairdressing industries. It's just technology of two pieces of iron that Samson and Delilah used. Anthony and Cleopatra used two bits of metal. And yet, a scared economy is hopeless. It's not gone particularly global. So some sectors are pretty national, and pins in Adam Smith's days were pretty much national competition. But of course what's going to happen is that we go regional and eventually we go global as the division of labour goes global. Adam Smith believed in trade, but he had a picture that you would have to go straight up this axis with fragmentation. If we now say that for any given level, what is the concentration level, then you can plot the position on the right. So if an industry is obviously local, you use a national concentration, an NCR4. A regional one if you're a low-cost airline. There are very few sectors like that, but they're regional much more for various reasons. So I'd use a regional one. But in most industries, by far the majority, I have to use a global metric of concentration, the global CR4. So I position your industry on the top right. So the FARG, Facebook and Amazon, etc., would be the top right, closest towards Marx, if you like. But notice how the whole picture's changed as the pin industry, back by 1980, only 4 companies one Scandinavia, 1 Germany, 2 North America dominate all of Adam Smith's pins. Marx is right, it did concentrate. But it wasn't totally monopolistic in most cases. It was oligopolistic. That is the Greek word. We all play Monopoly. Oligopoly is when a few players dominate. Just the Greek word for few, oligos. So the norm is really in the middle. These have all gone that way. And notice that your theoretical perspective of it has any relevance whatsoever shifts, depending on where the preponderance of the sectors are in your economy. And unfortunately, most sectors are no longer down in this little corner at the bottom. Most sectors are in the middle, and what you see is a dynamic effect. So it's crucial to know, do you have a Marxist kind of view of the world top right all the time? Well, there are some industries where that perspective gives some valid, useful things. Or do you take a perfect market neoclassical economics view? That's very powerful too. But to have 2 parts of the world threatening each other with nuclear weapons because they disagree over the 2 poles is kind of crazy when those are the exceptions. The norm is in the middle with a Schumpeterian, much more positive, far less exploitational system in the middle, and it's dynamic. But I would see it does depend. The data changes. You want the facts before you have your theory. So what we then look at, when we say, well, okay, we understand that global oligopolies, the players the top 4, could be quite powerful. The next question is, how powerful? Well, the answer is so powerful that if you're interested as an economist in wealth creation and GDP, you cannot possibly understand it if your perspective is a tiny little corner of that chart of where industries are. Just take one company, Apple. Actually, I got all the figures this morning. You can have Apple's latest GDP, Apple market cap, in the Financial Times today. You can check it, 2.7 billion. That's now 2.7 trillion. The whole of the British FTSE was 2.9. One company. Right? So can I just leave it out? The whole of the British GDP, that number 6 country in the world, 2.8 trillion. Now market cap is not directly comparable with GDP. We have to make a transition through calculation. So it exaggerates the change. But if you think you're interested in wealth, and you cannot understand not just Apple, but all the other players like it, you are living in a different planet to the real economy. So if I add up these top few players, the top 4, just added them up just this morning coming in, and they are, we just add them up today, it's 8.5 trillion or so. Gone up. So if we were to say, well actually, look, I've got this theory about the economy, it's just this little tiny bit, and you leave out even 5 companies, that's pretty big. Even in Adam Smith's day, the Dutch East India Company had a market cap at its peak. If you adjust for inflation, it actually had a market cap of 8 trillion. So it is a little bit of a lacunae, even for Adam Smith, to have kind of list out what actually that was a global monopolist at that time. And it also had the world's biggest army. So it's creating quite a lot of value-added salaries as well. So this is such a big effect that really, what if we could analyse all of those companies? Well, I've started you off in chapter 1 of the book with a little taster. I won't take just 5 companies, I'll take 30,000. And by the way, anyone who wants to work with me on this, we use $1 million now. We have $1 million on S&P Capital IQ. That is 99% of all market caps. And we can analyse it. We don't need to make conjectured theories about, I've got a theory with a little squiggle that says, it might look like this. You don't know what it looks like because you haven't got the data. We have the data. And what happens if we analyse the data? These top 4 players, I'm just taking 30,000 companies. We can use much bigger data sets than this for big data. Notice what happens. The bottom line, if I take let's add up the EBITDAs, the earnings before tax and interest. Remember, value added, which becomes part of your GDP figure, is my total gross earnings plus my total salaries. Okay, I'll add up all the earnings of all these top players. And I've done it for 3 years, 6 years, 3 years. And you know, it's pretty well a 40% rule. We take 40% of everything. Now, take 40% of sales or whatever, we take 45%, by the way, of all profits. And it doesn't end there. We take 45% of all R&D. The R&D expense, 44. Sales and general admin, which leads to marketing, branding, we take 40%. Capital expenditure, 39%. My rule of thumb, 40. And what if you know that you're just above the average line in that first chart I showed you from Harvard, our little picture? What is it? 60%. Slightly under 59. And you come roughly 50 on every one of them. But I simply know that your sector is just above average. It's going to be a GCR for about 40%. And frankly, why don't we know this? You wouldn't go driving in a car without your little Google Maps, would you? You wouldn't say, I've got a theory that, you know, it might be here, it might not. You'd have a map. I've got you a map. And so we know how to create wealth in the 21st century in a way that Adam Smith could could never have done at that time. We have big data, we can do it. So what happens if we say, well, look, but you know, I'd quite like to know how this is divided around the world. Well, the same thing applies. 4 nations, America, China with Hong Kong, Japan, and Britain's quite a lot lower actually, but you can take off Britain and it's still 52%. 52%. These are where the head offices are of those companies. Are we going to ignore that? Well, if you live in Belgium or somewhere else, if you think you can ignore that effect, that's fine. You can have all the theories you like, but you don't have the data to endorse your theories at all. So this helps. We can suddenly, and this time I've been careful. I haven't just taken market caps. I've taken all salaries, where we can make estimates for salaries, and all profits. That is the figure that goes into your GDP. If Adam Smith, remember there's 2 definitions of wealth. One are assets, but Adam Smith is very careful to go for income. This is your income statement, national. And I've analysed it just like that. So that means that that's value added. By the way, you might want to know about profit. You might want to know your company strategies. What's the average rate of return? Your shareholders certainly want to know. I've given you the return on capital. What about the sales? What about the 6-year added up return on sales? I've done it. What about the sales growth? I don't care if I'm making more money, but I would like to be going up in terms of global market share. The proxy is a 5-year sales growth. There's the data. So we don't have to go kind of like Samsung blind into Gaza. We've got the data to analyse it. Now, one of the things we can then do is to say, well, how does a country maximise its wealth? How can we see what's going on in these sectors in a way we could analyse it? We're going to give you 2 examples today. One is cars and the other is IT, very quickly. But basically, the key thing to recognise is that 30 years ago, when I studied economics, we could do most economics as if it's national players. GKN in those days was mainly, we were a national oligopolies. Most of our sectors, we were the number 1, but we were a national oligopolies. What I didn't realise was, being a national economy, oligopolies, I couldn't even pronounce the word, was dead. Every one of my 9 plants in the forgings industry, and either 1,000 to 2,000 people and colleagues, and every single one of them evaporated and have gone. Because national oligopolies disappeared. They were wiped out. And if you might think, oh, knowing the difference between 2 words, does it matter? I didn't realise it. It mattered. Because the other side of the company was going global. And I worked with that side, and that survived and made so much money during the 1980s that we were 2/3 of the company's total corporate profits. So, therefore, the wealth of the nations is now generated by what I call global oligopolies, top 4 players, and where it comes to is that wealth is now coming in predominantly not through your national champions, but through foreign direct investment inward. It's the subsidiary, because those big oligopolies disperse those assets worldwide, and they need to. That's what we had to do. So if I took my experience at GK, and I won't go through too quickly, but when we put in, we had trade in the 1950s, for heaven's sake. Trade is not where wealth creation is about. But by the 1960s, we were buying up M&A. It took Burfield. It took 10 years to acquire that company, and with it came the patents for transmissions that you need on all small cars. So then the Americans suddenly realised, and they paid the entire capital cost for us to give them that technology in America. We built their plants for Ford, and then we had assets in France, Italy, Germany, Unicard, and our little Ford project management team. We had site teams out in America. We had Unicard helping us in Germany, Burfield helping us in Britain, and that went took the American market. We took a deal with NTN, and to do a license deal, then it went global. 36 plants all the way around the world, India, China, and then eventually we go into Russia because we have to follow Ford to Russia. And then we transitioned, every one of those joint ventures, 25 years later, has transitioned into a full M&A. So notice the way we create wealth is by foreign direct investment. Those are assets on the ground to fight a global war. They are not just a wee bit of trade. We put technology into the countries that want it, like India and China and so on. So that's crucial. And so how can we kind of model this? Well, one little way we kind of model it is with a theory which Abhijit's going to take a little bit further in a moment, but we call it the double bubble theory. But the first thing to notice is that when you go through the transition to globalization, actually comparative advantage, Ricardo's advantage does matter. And Michael Porter's little diamond model is quite nice. It does matter how we handle it. If you want to survive that concentration globally, it does help to be in the right countries. The guys in the automotive industry in the wrong countries, Brazil or whatever, they had great markets. So the Spanish had great markets, number 6 at one point. They were pretty wiped out because you do need quite a competitive base. So the Germans, the Americans, Japanese, and then later the emerging market players could come in. So that theory of Porter we have enveloped into a slightly broader picture. In our view, you have a national bubble of wealth creation. In our case, it was Rover cars. In Spain's case, it was Seat cars. And that national bubble may or may not be strong. Generally, having a national champion for Michael Porter is bad industrial structure. You do not want a monopolistic structure at home. It's better to have vigorous competition if you want to get to the Olympics. And it does matter about the consolation of the supply industries, and it does help to have the demanding customers. But we were not good in that sense. But far and away the most important thing is, do you have an effective strategy globally? Rover did not. It had a brilliant joint venture for a time with Honda. That was superb. I studied that in detail. But it's long-term, taken out of Ford, that very successful alliance by BAE and the British government. But that strategy failed. And with it, all wealth creation, right the way through the self, has evaporated. It's a bubble that evaporates. He's my national player. And look, where does my wealth come from? It comes only from the global winning oligopoly players. And just as I wrote my PhD thesis, the British government was paying for me to go and take out Honda to dinner because we were courting, under the days of Margaret Thatcher, courting the top 3 Japanese companies, Nissan, Toyota, and Honda, and I was going around them, all their suppliers. And the British currency went down from 2 million to 1 as Rover collapsed, Ford went down, and then it suddenly comes up again. And it was on schedule to come right back up to 2 million. But not 2 million old cars, these are top modern technology. And the Japanese are joined by BMW, by VW, and then Tata from India. That is superb world-class technology. The only thing that broke that was Brexit. It's now back right down again, I'm afraid, the home bubble. But what I'm saying is, this is the foreign bubble. It's FDI-based. And it is revitalizing that sector. If you say, where does wealth creation come from in the double bubble? Unfortunately, the first one has gone. And the second one, fortunately, has come back like Phoenix from the ashes. So, but it's quite subtle. You need to have, when you look at your home player, you need to think primarily about the global strategy. It helps to think about the surrounding clusters and Michael Porter and so on. But notice there is a multiplier effect. When we create value, it goes all the way through the value chain. Typically you multiply by 2, or something like that. There's an extra benefit. But secondly, there is a negative. in order for GKN to go global, we had to totally transform the balance sheet. We had to say, look, we're mainly in the UK. God, 90% or something. Our customers around the world, there are 15 of them, you can name them. Clearly, we have to have a total transformation in that total format for people, sales, and assets, technology, all sweep around the world. So that's negative to Britain because we're having to put the assets into China and India. Thank goodness we did. But so that something is one bubble that may or may not be declining. In some cases, we are showing IT, it can go up. If you look at the foreign bubble, notice you must now take their perspective, their country perspective. And you say, well, in America, do they have a really good competitive thing for Apple? Well, they do. But their dispersion now, though, is positive because it's the only source of wealth for me and Britain. The name of the game is to get more than your fair share of incoming foreign direct investment. Why did Russia continue to decline economically at the end of the era of the Berlin Wall? It's the most negative country in the world on FDI. I lecture across Russia, you know, and I've seen Russian companies, but sadly they're not as hospitable as they might be. China was the opposite. Toughest negotiators in the world, but incoming FDI transformed that economy. Quite right. And they use the foreign direct investment, and later you can then have your own home bubbles. So I'm lastly just going to sort of leave with just a kind of this double bubble theory, and give you a bit of an idea of what happens in cars. I'm going to watch time a little bit. So what happened, to sum up the car situation, is that when Rover failed, our car production went down, it halved. Then our courting of the Toyota built them in. And you can see the forecast, having come down from 2 million to 0.85, they were now, come down to 1 million, they were projected to get back up to 1.7. Then came Brexit and COVID, so it's been hit. But if we take India, we're going to touch on India with IT. One foreign direct investment by Suzuki with actually a failed small Indian car company had such a transformation that it suddenly produced modern cars. These cars that came from monopolists in India, Premier, Hindustan, Tata Motors, 1958 technology because they had a monopoly, they didn't have to change anything. Then came one foreign direct investment, a joint venture with Suzuki, and it transformed them. The Indian government then said, right, we're having the other multinationals in. When I interviewed them, Suzuki had called, Maruti had called in every supplier, said, you see what we have done for India, every one of you suppliers are going to go and get me a joint venture partner across the world. First, world class, you've got 18 months to do it. Total transformation in the Indian market. Now we have a very competitive Indian market. Tata has finally taken over Jaguar and so on. So that foreign bubble now becomes part of our dominant bubble. Look at America. America was 60% of all world cars. And then became the beginning of transplants as the Japanese went into America in the 80s. Today, look at the total output. They've come down from being 60% of the world to, America today, car production, latest figures from The Economist, 2.5 million. China, 21 million. Mainly through joint ventures, FDI, VW, GM has a huge joint venture, and we have some local cars as well. Massive, complete transformation in that bubble. And the next change will be potentially Tesla. Because what then happens is that just sums up what happened. You can see our bubble evaporating on the left, but the positive bubble is not evaporating. The foreign bubble is one that's growing. And so I'll leave that, but I just ought to finally mention that if we quickly want to analyse any global industry, all we're going to do is just go to market caps to give you an idea of the future of this oligopoly position. one bonus for America is I can add up all the car companies in the world, and it comes to, I guess, about 680 billion. What's the market cap of Tesla this morning? It's about 854 billion. So the Schumpeterian effect, if you believe the stock market, will come in to revive the US home bubble, although it's going to take some time. The PE ratio is just into the 200. But can you see that these bubbles, in the case of the car industry, and we're now going to illustrate another industry, can you see that if you don't understand what is happening to global oligopoly, if you then don't push on and think what is happening to these wealth bubbles, and if you don't recognize in the last 20 years they have inverted, you're missing the point. You need that FDI, you need to understand those top global oligopolies, and think a little bit. With big data we can analyze all of that wealth effect, but the policy issue is how can we get more than our fair share? Now we're going to look at IT and professional IT services, where India started off in 2000 without any sector, and then came 2000 and the Indian home bubble started taking off. How many people will tell you, but you have a home bubble and a foreign bubble, what happens?
Thank you, Professor Chris, and thank you, Jacqueline, and everybody in the Durham School who has helped to organize this. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I started off my career with the IT industry after completing my computer science engineering, and then I worked across different countries like US, UK, and India in different industries, working across the different IT challenges. And currently I am the disaster recovery and the business continuity manager for Fanduel. So I'm going to now walk you through the IT industry. So prior to even getting into the details of the IT industry, so I'm going to talk a bit about the double bubble framework. So if you see, it's basically broken up into 4 quadrants, and A, B, C, and D. So the first quadrant on the left-hand side, it shows like what the national companies are contributing to the home. So for example, if I take TCS, Tata from India, like what's the contribution towards the wealth of nation for India from Tata, that will give us in the quadrant A. And if you look at quadrant B, then it basically tells you what Tata is contributing to the wealth of nation for the other countries. And similarly, if you look on the right-hand side, we are going to talk about the foreign multinationals, like we were, when Professor Chris was talking about the FDIs. So what FDI India has got from those IT companies, and if you look at quadrant D, it talks about the multinational that's been contributing to their own home country. And we are going to demonstrate this with the help of an example. So for this model to work on, the most important thing is from which country you are looking at. So if you are looking at from an India perspective, it could be very different for the same company if you look from a US perspective. Like IBM is an American company but still operating in India. But if you look at Tata, it's an Indian company, and it's obviously when it comes to America, we talk about the FDI that's contributing to the wealth of nation. So that's what the 4 quadrants talked about. Now let's look at some of those figures. So 20 years back, we heard probably there was hardly much in terms of the home players from India, and this IT sector is pretty interesting because UK, like the home players as well as the foreign multinationals, and then how the 2 bubbles have changed based on the industry trends that have gone over the last 20 years. Now, if you look here, 20 years back, there was hardly any contribution from India, but there was majority of the contribution was from the foreign multinationals, where the global concentration was around 78%. So the top 4 players took around 78% of the market share, and it has actually gone down over the period of time. So over the last 2 decades, it has gone from 78 to 50%. That shows that there is a trend of global war across the IT industry. And IBM was the dominant player who dominated the industry in terms of like among, if I compare IBM's market cap with the top 4, then it had 78%, and IBM's market cap with the industry, it has 61%. So it was quite dominating in terms of IBM being one of the key players. And as you can see, the IBM's contribution, or in terms of the IBM's concentration across the industry and over the top 4, has reduced over the last 2 decades. And we're going to see how that it has changed the shape of the industry. Now, here we are looking at the profit, the revenue, and again, if we break them by the concentration, so right now you can see the global concentration was from 72 to 54%, and that was the trend for the global war. And we have seen the contribution from the Indian companies has started coming up. So if I look from the overall industry revenue, in 2010, the Indian companies only contributed around 7.7%, to compare that of in 2019, where we have contributed to 15.5%. So it's once upon a time which was completely dominated by the top 4 players, and IBM was the key player. We don't have the similar situations right now in 2019, where we have the new emerging Indian players coming up in the IT industry.
It might be worth just showing them the quick overview slide, which gives them all the players. If you have just the beginning, we skip that slide. It's worth, if you don't know the industry, I think I've given you the slide in the home. That's it. Just it gives people an overview of who the players are. It's all the market caps, basically.
Sure. Thank you. So obviously, looking at this table, you can see like the firms are there on the topmost row, like the IBM, Accenture, Fujitsu, TCS, Cognizant, Capgemini. Their headquarters are based out of US, Ireland, India, US, depending on the country, the players. What has been their sales revenue across the IT industry, how much employees that they are employed, and what the market cap looks like. So this in a nutshell gives you the picture of all the IT companies that's there with headquarters situated in different countries. And that clearly tells us that if we want to increase the wealth of the nation, we need to get those FDIs from the different foreign nationals. But that's when I'm looking from an India perspective. If I look from a US perspective, then say the IBM company become a home bubble for them. For them, TCS is more like a foreign direct Indian FDI that will be contributing towards their wealth of nations. Now, obviously, we saw like how the revenue has been changing over the period of 2 decades. Now, let's look at the value add. So, if you look at the value add, so this we'll talk about the 2 different bubbles. We have been talking about the FDI and the home bubbles, and this is from an IT industry. So, we looked at Accenture, IBM, Cognizant, Fujitsu, Capgemini, CGI, and none of them are headquarters in India. But if you look at TCS, Infosys, HCL, Wipro, they are all like headquarters in India. So this part is going to contribute to the home bubble, whereas this one would be the FDI part that will be contributing to the wealth of nations. And as you can see here, the TCS and Infosys, the value had significantly increased, almost like over 300%. But IBM's value has actually kind of decreased, like by 20%, looking at over the 2 decades from 2010 to 2019. But some of them were compensated by, if you look at the Accenture, the way the revenue has been increased over the period of time. So some of the value add which got decreased by IBM was compensated by some of the other companies. Now, the most interesting part will be to see how this has impacted the 2 bubbles, like when we come to how the wealth of the nations has been created. So looking at these 2 bubbles, so this is the FDI bubbles and this is the home bubble. So we spoke about the Indian players who were like the TCS, Wipro, Infosys and HCL, who have contributed to the wealth of nation for India, and these are from the foreign bubbles. So initially in 2010, when the Indian market was just emerging, so we had minimum contribution, and 97% of the FDI, like the revenue that was generated from the IT industry, 97% was from the foreign direct investment that was coming in, and there was a minimum of 3% contribution from the Indian players. But when we moved down to 2019, then the FDI, the foreign direct investment, actually got reduced as the global concentration led to global war. But that was compensated by the home bubble when it spoke about the revenue coming from, the major Indian players. So with the reduction in global concentration, the FDI bubble can get reduced, and it also helps to understand if a particular company is not getting enough contribution towards the wealth of nation from a particular industry, which bubble, what do you need to change in your policy? So for example, to attract the FDI, what do you need to do, and how do you encourage, how do you motivate your home players so that they can be one of those emerging market leaders contributing to the wealth of nation. So that combined gives you always a better picture for any country.
Yeah, so I'll just try and put the two studies together. So where that's useful is if you've got a database of even 30,000 companies, but let alone 1 million, there's nothing to stop you analysing those sectors one by one and saying, well, what's happening to the transformation? Where is wealth changing? And his home bubble went from being 3% to being actually very, very attractive because it plays to their competitive advantage. They actually have a good story on the FDI bubble as well. It's not as good as the Indian one, but that is the double whammy win. So let's just compare the two sectors, cars, and bring it together with the car industry and the IT industry. Let's just look at those wealth bubbles. Look at the UK. The cars gone. Cars, the foreigners is substantial, though threatened a little bit by Brexit. Could be a little bit damaged by that. IT, we're footloose, but our biggest players, Accenture, are really a bit more footloose. They're Irish, if anything, and really a bit American. But that's then we've got that story. That's a worthwhile foreign bubble, really, to the UK, but not as big as India. All the MNCs are going into India right now. If you look at America, halved on the cars bubble, but Tesla could change it again in the next 5-10 years. So it's exciting transformation. It's certainly not quite tacit equilibrium collusion. Then if we take their latest, if we then take IT, they're one of the global winners in IT. Microsoft, IBM, they're very, very good. But so they're strong, they have a good, strong home bubble, but they're dispersing a lot of that, and a lot of that wealth is going to places like India, which is being backed up by the Americans. So we can see a transformation in India. I mean, cars gone from pathetic cars, really bad technology, monopolistic home, to actually a very vibrant industry post just one FDI from Suzuki. They become part of the global world. And these guys retaliated. They produced some better vehicles, and they've taken over Rover. So India in cars is small, but now is actually not a bad global winner. I mean, most of us think China will probably win out long term, and as compared with India, but it's certainly not disappeared. Those players, Tata Motors and so on, are still there, and I'm still interviewing them. So, and then if we look at USA, cars were 90%, then comes in the Japanese FDI, and now the home players have gone bankrupt, have lost a lot of market share. Unless the stock market's crazy, they've only got Rover, Ford and General Motors together at 80 billion. Tesla's 800 billion market cap. Well, unless those stock markets are crackers, they've changed, they've transformed. So I hope you can see that bubbles give you a bit of a sense of which sectors, you have to do it except one sector, they may be transforming. So you do need to understand about the global top 4 players in your sectors, because we do take half of all wealth creation all the way around the world. You do have to understand about foreign direct investment. We're not just using trade, we're putting assets on the ground. And my model is quite relevant because these sectors, cars and so on, have shifted towards top right, but not totally Marxist. It's dynamic equilibrium in the middle, and you need to understand that. And you want the FDI of those top players. And you may be quite content to be in this tiny little quadrant down here, because your whole career depends on being a neoclassical economist who is determined to conjecture that it's a fragmented industry. Well, that was kind of right for Adam Smith 250 years ago when we came up with the idea in Edinburgh that actually it's the rare exception. The Marxist extreme, you do see it with some of these internet companies, but it's not going to sustain eventually. We're going to have to get them. We may even put in anti-trust. This middle ground is the exciting wealth creation ground. And to understand that strategically is very important. So, broadly to sum up, broad, crude Marxist planning, mercantilism a la Trump. And we had it in Britain at the time of Adam Smith. He was rightly opposing it. It's just negative. But that's not really proved to be that successful. Globalization hasn't completely gone that easily, and we have huge challenges. But nevertheless, I'm not using the word in a loose sense. I'm talking about global concentration, measurable processes that affect the economy, that affect wealth creation, that affect your living standards in your countries. So I hope I've shown you that scale economies do matter, but it's not a total kind of one-way pole necessarily. So if you want to maximize the wealth of your country, you want to get more than your fair share of that FDI. China did an extremely good job of getting in good FDI, and they negotiated pretty hard, but they did a good job. Without that, they would never have transformed the Chinese economy. Do a bad job, and you end up in poverty. Greece actually deterred a lot of entry, and their poor young people found that their salaries almost halved for a period in desperate unemployment. Because they thought, well, we don't really need the economic system. Yes, you do. It's not a good thing to do. So you do want a few winners. It is good to have a few global champions, but you will have very few. In a world of 100 equal countries, and okay, America counts 5, China counts 5, but if you imagine a world of 100 equal countries, and there are 1,000 product sectors, because there are more, let's say there's 1,000, it's pretty obvious where we're going as global oligopolies. You are going to get 1,000 divided by 100, 10 sectors that you will be world class in. Multiply by that by 5 or 10 if you're China or America. But if you're Belgium, stick with that number. And that is horrific. That means that we will lose huge numbers of our home bubbles that will just evaporate. But the good news is, while you are becoming productive, the foreign direct investment coming in, that is not negative. Our car industry has not got worse because we've got world-class players coming in. So, I hope I've convinced you it's important. I hope I've convinced you that global concentration matters. Using big data this way can be very powerful to understand where profits, where GDP comes from, where it's dispersed. And even we fans, including us from Edinburgh, of Adam Smith, must now acknowledge pervasive global oligopolies and more universal perspectives than kind of neoclassical general equilibrium that I kind of left Cambridge with 50 years ago. I knew that stuff. But what we had to do was to give you the next bit of the picture. So I end up with a misquote from Trotsky. You may not be interested in global wars, global oligopolies, or their wealth creation funds. But, as Trotsky said, global wars are interested in you. Thank you very much for listening. We'll have to take questions. I'm sure we've overrun on time. Our fallback plan has worked. You'll be pleased to know. Okay. thank you. That water really lovely. Okay, we now want to move to the human side of life in global multinational companies. We all have to go off on assignments to other countries, which I have to do every year in Iraq or something. And it's always a bit of a cultural challenge if you work for big global companies around the world. And even the most conducive countries like India have hidden dangers in terms of my assumptions about these people are not necessarily theirs when it comes to leadership. So the plan for this part of the session with myself is a paper with Purva Vaswani, and I'm going to start dealing with research we did first of all in Thailand. We first pinpointed Thailand as a country where almost everyone from around the world found them slightly weird in different ways. The British, the Americans noticed that this country that had been fiercely independent for 200 years was quite different culturally, but so did the Japanese. The Japanese have a fairly homogeneous culture, and also they found it quite a cross-cultural challenge. So we thought, why don't we use one country as the single base point for all the companies around the world going to? And we'll start with field research. We did 20 studies at the beginning, then we moved to LinkedIn, and then we developed the theoretical model. And then Purva, more recently, has then said, right, let's do the same in India. Again, visiting about 20 cases in India, and then checking for exactly how similar, whether the model works or not, and what's subtly different in India. And then, to cap it all, because she'd taken a consistent approach, she can then compare directly with all those worldwide companies going into Thailand, say how does that compare with the Indian experience. So I'm going to lead off talking about the first part of the research, the experiences in Thailand. Thank you so much. And the question, the research question in both these papers is, if you're an expatriate manager, particularly if you're a country head, how are you going to adjust your leadership style when you lead people in foreign subsidiaries? There are going to be similarities, there are going to be differences in your style. So that's the first part of the answer seems to be, well, find out something about the country, what's different. Fortunately, we've got all these studies like Hofstede, Globe studies in our views are the more sophisticated ones. And Globe has even moved on to look at actual leadership styles, not only talking about societal differences, but actual what types of leadership seem to go down well. So we thought, well, what we want to pick up is not so much your preferred leadership style, as to how do you adapt that preferred leadership style when you meet a challenge of Thailand or later India. So when we first started doing that in Thailand, there were no previous studies of adaptation. There were hundreds of what's different. But the key point is, if you go to Thailand, the first thing they will tell you is, we do not pay you 3 times the salary of people in Thailand for doing in Thailand exactly as the Thais do. We pay you to be a leader, and we like you to be a leader. So the question is, how far? If you don't adapt at all, frankly, you could get into trouble. But as a leader, do you do in Rome as the Romans do? If that was purely the answer, all you'd have to do would be a course on Hofstede or Globe. The problem is, you're the leader. And it turns out that just being assimilated is not the most successful strategy in the eyes of those execs. But let's look at what actually happens. So we thought, let's look at those. We got a theoretical question that has not actually been addressed. Loads of articles on differences in culture, but not many on what the country head is supposed to do. And from the viewpoint of anyone's career, everyone likes to think they know about strategy in top-level companies. But if you don't make it in that first assignment overseas as a multinational, you're never going to get anywhere near the boardroom. So, you know, it's worth knowing something about how to manage a country head position. So the theory we used to draw out the empirical data was an old theory by Nicholson, which he called the theory of work transitions. Has anyone come across that? It's an HRM model, and it says that when you go through a change, any change of job, there's a challenge in terms of you might be moving to you might be changing the content of the job, and you might also be developing yourself. Your personal style may have to develop. So there are two challenges, the personal development and your role development. And the point is, when you go to become country head of a different country, your role moves right up to a top exec type role. That's a big change. But now I'm dealing with China. Wow, that's another big change. And the theory that Nicholson produced is that, well, that would then be high role discretion, becoming a chief executive, and high in terms of novelty, because you're now in a new country. High, said Nicholson, would predict an exploration mode of adjustment. That means a 50-50% journey. Half of it is you learning a little bit about how to do in Rome as the Romans do. The other half is about your subordinates learning a lot about how you want things done. It's a 50-50. But there are alternatives. Some people would say, yeah, but some countries, particularly in Asia, are quite determination. They don't, you know, a lot of companies say, well, your way is going to be our way. We're such a big company, our corporate strategy is going to, our corporate culture will dominate your country. Thank you very much. You join us, you take our things. That's a determination style. The exorbitant style is when you do in Rome as the Romans do. You are very, very empathetic and sensitive to the fact that different countries are different. But you know that doesn't always work, but it's a possibility. Then the last style, said Nicholson, is replication. Well, that just applies when you're low level, you're not particularly powerful, you're pretty well doing the same job that you did in America. That's not really going to be a lot of adaptation, that's a replication. You more or less do the job you did before. If you're chief executive or very senior manager, it's likely to be one of those three quadrants. So what we found in Thailand, we predicted the exploration mode, and here's what we found. I better give you a sample. Stage one. So stage one is American, British, Japanese, and Thai execs in multinationals. Stage two is we had a Chinese collaborator come in to help us on LinkedIn to set up surveys so we could get quotes in from 169 execs from 24 countries. And then stage three was actually me going back to Thailand and matching up the sample with more Europeans, but we haven't yet published that last bit, so if you want to publish with me on that, come in by all means. Hypotheses is basically, do we have a picture of convergence, divergence, or is it a mix? Do we all start doing the same thing with our leadership styles? We come from different countries, America, Japan, and so will we be similar, or will we still be very different? And is it a question of cross-versions? Is it a question of adaptation? So, stage one of the study, Saskia is from Thailand, so she's speaking the local language, she knows the country. So we set up, first of all, we set up 7 Thai chief executive interviews to basically clarify the Thai model. How similar is it to Globe or Hofstede? Can we please just confirm or disconfirm? Understand that. But then, having got a clearer picture, we then want to say to the Americans, the Japanese, and the British, yeah, okay, what's your perception about those differences and how do you adapt to it? So, these are the profiles of the execs, the sort of indices there in the first the Americans 5, then the British, then the Japanese, and then the Thais. So that kind of gives you the background. We can dwell on that later. And we very similar sample, 20 in India, with some Indian companies, but then others in other countries that we're comparing. We have a number of issues we picked up from those first studies about, well, you know, maybe Hofstede globe is a little bit unsubtle. What's really going on in the culture? The sort of things that came up is very indirect communications in Thailand. No one really wants to put things directly. Very sensitive to feelings and criticisms and so on. So we get a lot of feel from the Thai execs of the sort of cultural issues to them being on the receiving end of leadership, or the style they would expect is a little bit subtly different to what we might expect if we've not been there before. Ineffectiveness in team working, they're not that good at team working in the perceptions of international execs, but actually even in the perception of the Thais, we're very groupy, we like to stick together. You might find that in your country when you all go and have a meal out in a mixed group of students or something. So we're picking up differences in style based on those first interviews before we can really talk about adaptation. Then you can now see, well, yeah, okay, well, how do you actually lead? In this case, if you're an American, if you're a Japanese, you know, what's your attitude to adaptation? Now, Yamaha would say, the chief executive said, no, you know, everything hinges on a Japanese company on accepting the Yamaha values. I'm not going to compromise on that. Another thing about Japanese executives, you've got to go back home or to the next country, and you have to be loyal. You know, if you haven't been loyal to the Yamaha way, your next assignment's going to be somewhere pretty unpleasant. You know, it's partly cultural, but you can see that from the quotes, what we're going to have to do is to classify their strategies, and based on going through all the quotes we have. So a little bit of a comparison there, but I'll leave that one for the moment. So broadly, if I just take those field studies, then what we found, slightly against the literature, is only one American chief executive that was using what we regarded as the 50-50 exploration style, of the ones interviewed, mind you. And then if we look at the determination style, actually, for Americans, British and Japanese, that is the dominant style. If you say to these guys, what works for you, actually, they're not totally comfortable with when Rome do as Rome do. They are a little bit more assertive than that. In those cases, actually, the most adaptive, the most willing to adapt in that particular set of interviews were the Brits, surprisingly. It's not a majority, but of actual people interviewed, it's almost a majority. I like to put it down to the British Empire, that perhaps one of the good things that came out of the British Empire was that we had to respect some of the local cultures like India, and we realised we could possibly manage the situation if we told them what to do. So maybe there's an element there, I don't know. But of those people interviewed, actually it's not quite what you'd expect from the theory. It's a lot more determination there. But it's a little bit country-based too. Some countries have a different pattern. So I've given you in the paper that we've done, this is actually published in International Journal of Human Relations Management with Dr. Seid, who published her first, because she wrote the article. Well, she finished writing it up. We did the research in Edinburgh. But the determination style kind of quotes, we kind of want to give you that feel for what it's like to be in each of these boxes and the sort of things they're saying. So absorption, you know, this is the British company, two execs talking. You know, I think they do behave differently, and you've got to be patient. You've got to be gentler, you know. You've got to spend more time encouraging. So not quite the same as the Yamaha style, I have to say. And this is the attitude on the American, the one we classified as exploration. You know, I think it's a combination of both. You bring your management style, you tweak it to make it work in a Thai culture, and so on, and giving you exactly the sort of feel for what they are saying. Then we think, well, we've got to pick out the moderators, the other variables that are affecting this, and we found that, what's going on, what's pushing them? Well, some of those issues are coming out quite strongly in the interview transcript. So that's kind of a moderating factor, this cultural effect. So we've tried to pick those out a little bit and show how they're effective. And so, again, specific quotes. So if I put that together, just to, yes, and stage 2. So we've got a bit of a picture of how it is from 20 case studies, but can we get slightly more comfortable in terms of a representative? So the next stage was we had a Chinese collaborator come in. We said, why don't we set up a LinkedIn site? Why don't we use LinkedIn? This is incredibly important to these guys. I've never seen more motivated people helping on the search. It's my job. I'm a kind of cross-cultural broker in that position between my country and Thailand. So what we then said is, okay, can you go onto this, can you come on to us? We're going to create an Excel with all your qualitative quotes, and we've got Excels of a whole lot. We can show you if we've got them, if you want to work somewhere else with it. And then we go through, doctor's I separately, I separately, classify, and then we put the scores together to say, okay, broadly, where are they? And actually that creates a much more comprehensive picture. We can cover 21 countries, all of which are experiencing novelty in Thailand. And then we can say to them, okay, now can we put the whole picture together? So we've got I've got the survey, guys, but notice the survey is much more in line with the theory, actually. Maybe they don't give away as much when you're not grilling them for an hour or two, because they're shorter, these interviews. But it's interesting that about 80% are actually going for expiration when you do the bigger survey. Perhaps not quite as senior. And again, the British, but again, this tends to be the minority. So it's like an 80-10-10 on the survey, with a little bit more on here on the absorption style. And so that gives you a little bit of feel, but of course it's slightly different when you do the field research to when you do a big, you get a lot of people coming in and then giving us whole series of quotes, but only on the internet, so it's not going to be as good with LinkedIn. So the model I produced then was to develop it, was that, here is the high role discretion when you move into the more senior job, high novelty. And actually I find there's kind of one lens is almost the country you come from. On that Thai data, the most determination orientated were the Japanese. Then came the Americans. Then later I went to Europe. I went and redid the first 12 interviews with new companies, because I thought we've got a great sample on LinkedIn, but we don't have quite as many continental Europeans, the Swiss, the Germans. So I balanced it up. And broadly, the continental Europeans seem to come in here, and the Brits came in at bottom as the most absorptive, the most willing to yield. But it is still, in total, that's the major style. But push from the Japan, followed by America, you tend to push that way. And these are the other elements that seem to come through. Perception of superiority of the home managerial approaches. Perception of the need to change the industry. The low cultural proximity to change, which is different by sector. Perception of the importance of the alignment between leadership. This is different between different corporates a little bit. This seems to be affecting, do I go up this direction or do I go softer? And then lastly, I've got another little, imagine you have a lens refracting the light. So we've got one lens refracting the light is your country effect. You've got these moderators, but the last effect, I'm sorry if I don't have this on the next one, is, I call this theory X a little bit, but is also the industry. because the guys in the banking industry, if we took one of the top European banks, they said if you looked at the visibility scores, the visibility index across the world, Thailand's the worst. If our bank gets caught for any corruption, we have wiped out the global brand. We cannot let the Thais do it. So they are very determination oriented. Similarly, if you're in the oil industry, they're quite mechanistic. They're fairly hard, and they tend to push more determination orientated. Then manufacturing in the middle. And then if you go to fast moving consumer goods, anything on the people side, the softy side, Ipsos Mori or something like that, dealing with beauty products, surveys, market research, they're actually very soft and quite pushing towards, they appreciate the absorptive stuff. They want a lot more sensitivity. So there seems to be a couple of lenses going on. The country you come from, the country of ownership, and also the industry as well as those moderators. So next stage, I would like to hand over to Purva because, we need to cover other parts of the world. That's a small country. But India is now like number 3 worldwide. And we thought it would be lovely to know, even without the language problem, how do we handle these people from India? Over to you, Purva.
So, hello everyone, I'm Purva Vaswani. Worked in various fields until now. Started off as an electronics and communication engineer. Worked in some technical fields. Then worked as a consulting firm in India. Then came here in University of Edinburgh. Completed my Masters in International Business and Emerging Markets. I'm currently working as a commercial analyst for an automotive parts supplier called Matthey. So this is my research on cross-cultural leadership adjustments. So basically how expatriate managers have to adjust their leadership style when they go into a culture that is exactly opposite to theirs. So I've chosen India for this study. So the research questions that I have taken up in this study are, first of all, how culturally different was India compared to where the expatriate managers were coming from. Then did they have to change their leadership style to adjust to the local environment in India? And if they did so, how they did it and to what extent did they have to do that? So we'll start off with some Indian traits acknowledged in the literature given before. So one thing is there is a very high, many researchers believe there is a high power distance, and the organizational structure in India is quite hierarchical. Other one is Indians deeply value their cultural dimension, and they want to stay rooted to that even in the organizational segment. They balance collectivism and competition. They are collectivistic. India is inherently a collectivistic society. But when it comes in the organizational setting, they are competitive as well because they are highly performance oriented. And so basically there is a balance between collectivism and the competition. So these are some of the traits that Indians display according to the literature that has been written until now. So the theoretical framework that I have used is quite similar to what Professor Carr explained for the Thailand's theory. So this is Globe's model. This started off from Hofstede's theory. So Hofstede gave like 6 dimensions of culture, 6 cultural dimensions. But the researchers believed that it was too narrow. So Globe developed on that model and converted it into 9 cultural dimensions with a lot of depth in them. So these are the dimensions, assertiveness, collectivism, future orientation, and so on. Not only did he give theories from the perspective of cultural dimensions, He also gave some leadership styles. He categorized them into these leadership styles such as autonomous, charismatic, value-based. I think Professor Carr spoke about it a little bit as well. So we'll move forward to the next one. Then comes the Nicholson's workload transition theory. So in India, he told that mostly people follow the exploration mode of workload transition. That is high leadership adjustment as well as modifying their employees' behaviors. We'll see how, so on the basis of this, I did my study and found out how it compares to this in the actual setting. So the methods that I used, so I had a sample of 20 people. I didn't know any of these people, but I found them through LinkedIn and through connections of connections. My grandfather knew a few people in the industry, so he connected me to those people, and then when I started talking to these people, I got in touch with some more people. So the data collection was basically in the form of semi-structured interviews. I had a structure in mind that I need to ask questions in this format, but whenever the conversation started, it was like examples turning into situations, like whatever happened to them. So it was always semi-structured. And I also did some surveys. So where I asked them to rank, to give numbers basically to the cultural traits and the leadership styles on the basis of which I calculated the averages. That was not a major part of my study, but I touched on it a little bit. So this is the profile of executives that I interviewed in India. So most of them were European in my sample size. There was one British and one American and two Indians. So in my study, we saw that determination mode was the most common mode of adaptation, leadership adaptation among most of the expatriate managers. This is contrary to what we saw in the Globe's model. So in the Globe's model, he said that India mostly shows acceleration mode of adjustment. That is high adjustment in the leadership as well as high adjustment in the employee behavior. But on the contrary to that, I saw that determination mode of adjustment, that is the leaders adjusted less and the employees were made to adjust more in that sense. So 60 to 70% of my sample was determination-based mode of leadership adjustment, but there was 30% around people in the sample who displayed exploration mode of adjustment. Basically, they also changed and they made their employees change accordingly as well. So this is basically an outline of how many, so 60% were determination mode, 33 were exploration, and there was one person who also displayed the absorption mode of adjustment, where he adjusted and he did not make the employees adjust anywhere. So he basically got adjusted to the customs and culture of India. So this is a bit more detail into my sample. So the 60% of 60% displaying determination mode of adjustment were mostly Europeans. So from Denmark, France. Then exploration one was from Africa, and then the rest of them were Europeans as well. And the absorption mode was displayed by the person from the US. Contrary to the Thailand study, where we saw the person from the US was displaying exploration mode of adjustment. So these are some of the factors that influenced the modes of adjustment. So I think two of the things things that stood out for me when I was interviewing these people were they said that culturally Indians are highly performance-oriented people. So there is huge competition between them. Although India is a collectivistic society, but when it comes to the organizational culture, they are highly competitive as well. So they ranked, most of them ranked India low on institutional collectivism, but they ranked them high on in-group collectivism. Basically, they all look out for each other, but their motivation to grow and like the competition spirit is quite high in that sense. The second one was high power difference. I think I missed this slide. Yeah. So all the 20 respondents said that Indian organizational culture is very hierarchical, and there is a huge power difference between each hierarchical level. So these are the two factors that stood out for me. But there was this factor about gender inequality. Now I interviewed two sets of people. Some of them were working in India like 10 years ago, and some of them were working in India very recently. So there was a mixed view on how the things have changed from 10 years ago up until now in this gender egalitarianism space. So they said the things are changing, and now since the past 5 years it has been a very rapid growth where the equality is being achieved between male and female working population. So now coming on to the leadership adjustment styles. So as I explained, India displayed mostly determination mode of adjustment, where the expatriate managers adjusted the behavior of the employees as compared to adjusting their own behavior. Now, one of the reasons could be that they thought that their leadership style was superior to the local leadership styles. Since I interviewed very less people from Indian, like who were Indian managers there, this could be a great study to develop the study into. So overall, there was according to Nicholson's theory, there was a prediction that it should be exploration, that it should work both ways, 50-50. But it did not happen in that sense, in my sense. So this does not match with the Nicholson's study. So I think Professor explained this model. I can move on from that. So instead of the explanation model which we saw in Thai study, we have the determination one in the Indian one. There was one more thing that these expatriate leaders mentioned, that they felt there was a need to change some of the aspects in the local working environment, and that is the reason they utilize the determination mode of adjustment. But the 30% of the population that displayed exploration mode of adjustment also said that Indians are inherently, like they are born with a competitive spirit, and they have very sharp minds. But sometimes they need that push because they are a bit shy when it comes to expressing their feelings and opinions to someone superior. So those were some of the reasons that they gave for choosing exploration mode of adjustment instead of determination mode of adjustment. So there was one person who said that he utilized the absorption mode of adjustment. So basically, he changed his style instead of changing the working environment. So one of the reasons that he mentioned for doing this is that he had already worked in India before, like he didn't work as a regular employee there before. but he was well acquainted to the culture, so it was very easy for him to get mixed up in the culture and adjust according to the culture. Then I've discussed these slides. So these are some mean values that I got from my surveys, where I ranked them. So I had 2 British employees, 2 British expatriate managers, and 3 from Nordic Europe and 6 from Germanic Europe. So basically, these are the ranks that they got. Like, for example, the British one, they are more charismatic and value-based leadership. I can dwell on that more. I'm just conscious of time a bit. So if you are interested, I can discuss more about it. So these are the scores that I got from my surveys. Another aspect of my paper was, like, while I was doing this study, COVID was going on. So I wanted to explore more about how the leadership changed in the COVID scenario. So this is basically the result of that. So most of the leaders said that we need to keep an adaptive leadership, mode of leadership. This is the need of the hour right now, because if a pandemic comes, everything went online, everyone had to change their ways of working. So in that sense, adaptive leadership is a very important part of the leadership culture right now, and everyone should adapt to it basically. So to conclude my study, so my first question was, how far has local culture affected leadership styles of expatriate managers in India? So first of all, they considered that, most of them thought that Indians were shy and did not express their opinion in front of their senior managers. But if they got a comfortable environment, they were more open to expressing their views and talking to the senior managers, and that's how it worked for them. Then I touched upon collectivistic tendencies. In-group collectivism was high, but institutional collectivism was a bit low. India is a very highly diverse culture, so some of them thought that gender inequality still exists, and it does, but it's transitioning and things are changing now at a very fast pace. So one of my questions was, which mode of adjustment was generally preferred in the Indian context? As I explained, it was mostly determination mode of adjustment over exploitation mode of adjustment, where they made their employees change according to their leadership style. So this is one of the graphs that I charted out. So this blue one is basically my study, and the orange one is the globe study. So there are a few factors like institutional collectivism and future orientation that are a bit different from the study. I can explain a bit more if you're interested in learning more about it. Same I did with different regions, people from different regions and the leadership styles.
You might want to finish.
So the future research proposition. So in my research, some of the limitations were that I did not, like I explained, I didn't get to interview many of the Indian managers. So this could be a very good comparative study between how the expatriate managers think leadership style changes in India, and it could be a comparative study in the sense that how Indian managers perceive it from their angle when it comes to expatriate managers. Another in-depth study could be done on the gender inequality side of the study. And
Can we just go to that slide where you've got your Indian results direct compared with my Taiwan's? You've got your hypotheses beautifully done. So just the one with both, I think, yes, that's right. there you can see
Yeah.
the India with Thailand, which I think is
Yeah.
quite a nice point at which to give us the bigger picture. And that's taking into account the survey results as well in Thailand, so you've got a much bigger sample there. But I think that's an interesting contrast.
Yeah. So basically, as I explained, India showed a lot more towards the determination side of adjustment, whereas Thailand is clearly dominated by the explanation mode of adjustment, that is 50-50. And here, mostly managers were not willing to bend that much and change their leadership style. They just made their environment cater to their needs. That's how it was. And I think the adoption percentage is fairly similar for both the studies.
Okay, shall I just
Yeah.
sort of hand it over for the slight sort of wrap up then?
Yeah.
But I think what's quite exciting there is that whether we take the survey results, whether we take the first time field research, whether we take the Indian situation, I think the one thing that does come out is that do in Rome as the Romans do, which if I put you on an intense course on Hofstede or Rome, is the tendency, what's different about China, let's try and get to that. That is what we're saying is really only half the problem, because it's not solely just a problem of adapting. You do need a certain amount of resilience to believe in your own kind of corporate model. And as we can see in Thailand, although eventually when we do the survey, we get quite large numbers doing the exploration style, as predicted, the 50-50, actually the field research was a little bit lower, and in Thailand and in India it's a lot lower. And what we're finding there is that although determination style is a minority style in Thailand, apart when it comes to all the surveys, actually it's very much the majority in India. And we were kind of warned, we don't know much about China. What do we think? And the Indians were saying to me, well, we suspect the Koreans and the Indian and the Chinese are actually quite assertive, but we could do with more research, and we've begun to do that. So let me just compare a little bit. We have some neat hypotheses worked out, stars for which ones work, which ones do not. But I won't dwell on that now because we've gone through that very thoroughly. Thank you very much, Purva. It's very hard to present that the first time. So just a little anecdotal thing that we finish on is the Economist last week or so, last month, was saying, well, actually post-Zoom, you might think about yourself here. Are you comfortable having meetings only in person? The country that says no, are the French, mainly, followed by India. So actually, if you're deciding how to adjust, and then the opposite extreme is Japan. So actually, COVID itself, whether we're prepared to Zoom or not with each other, actually seems to go a little bit with culture as well. So we've got some follow-up readings, we've got further studies going on. Some of you may find, you're interested enough to come on board and perhaps join our data sets and things. But so the first article published the first article from I've already given you was published International HRM with Dr. Tsai. The follow-up article recently was Thunderbird International Review. There we did it the other way around. We just said to one multinational, a big aerospace company, well, you're going into lots of countries. How do you adjust when it's you? L constant is the one variable. And then there's my follow-up study in Thailand. We then did a further study on Latin America, which we've just written up. We presented it to the Academy of Management. So that we're kind of ready to get out to publication. We then did a study in Taiwan because we thought it's quite complicated doing China because the institutional background takes quite a lot of understanding, the political background. But we used Taiwan because it's it's a Confucian culture with a slightly more kind of Western type of institutional thing. But so we've studied that. We've not yet published it, so if you want to come in on co-publications, that'd be quite interesting. And then, then we did a comparison where we took the Chinese experience in the UK, where we said, okay, how do the UK managers manage the cross-cultural action when they go to China? And how do the Chinese manage it when they come to Britain? So that was another kind of angle that we found quite fun. So we're always kind of looking for collaborators, and so that's my email, and you guys, you know, another big business school at Durham, and from many countries as well. So thank you for your attention, and any comments and suggestions are most welcome.